Sofía and I are going to take on the challenge of splitting up a short 20-minute talk into 2 10 minutes. So hopefully we do have time for questions. But yeah, so we're going to be talking about human rights in standardization and a bit of some work in the past on this and where we are today. Next slide. Great. So I wanted to give you a history. And when I went back to look at my notes, I keep thinking it's been about 10 years since we started the work, but it's actually been 12. So that's always fun to realize. Extra 2 years got missing there somewhere. So yeah, back in 2012, this is also where I was working at the time, the Association for Progressive Communications put out this report that said, hey, human rights organizations, you should look at this organization called the Internet Engineering Task Force, because they talk a lot about technology and they do it in a pretty open way. Their process and their principles seem to align with the work that we're doing. Now, that certainly wasn't the first time, 2012, people noticed that. It was just the first time, I think, that the particular like human rights oriented organizations really started paying attention. Fast forward, a couple other things that came out. I want to mention in 2014, this was a really important moment because the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights had published in 2013 a document called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So this took the human rights framework, which is really meant for states, nation states, because they are obligation holders for human rights, but it applied it to industry as we're sort of responsibility holders around human rights. And so then Article 19, another human rights organization, had this idea, what if you took this document and instead of just thinking about, Facebook or, Comcast, what if you actually started going lower into the technical stack and trying to apply these same principles? So yeah, that's kind of essentially what then kicked off this work with the chartering of this Human Rights and Protocol Considerations Research Group at the Internet Research Task Force. Some other notable things happened also in ICANN. There's an RFC, quite a long one, that describes what would be the human rights considerations in protocol design for the IETF. Next slide. So yeah, I mentioned this group was chartered. So back, since 2015, I think some of the things that I'm particularly surprised by whenever I look at the numbers is we've met 26 times. It's about 2 hours each time. Sometimes to talk about work. A lot of times we just are inviting talks to try to bring in a variety of different perspectives into the technical community. The talks range from discussions on censorship to privacy to encryption. A lot of talks focus on digital security for various communities. Emerging technologies is sort of a euphemism for AI these days, but in our case, I think we really are talking about emerging technologies. I think we've had discussions on satellites and other like Internet of Things, et cetera. And then yeah, we've had quite a few talks also on environmental sustainability. I would just reflect and point people towards the IETF meetings are really well documented in YouTube. So there's a whole playlist of all the HRPC meetings at this point that you could queue up if you really wanted to. Next slide. So these are just a few of the topics and like some of the insights. I'm not going to read every slide because then I would go over my allotted speaking time, but I just wanted to point folks to the fact that there's actually a privacy. So privacy is a human right. There's actually a privacy research group that we very much work in synergy with. And I think to great effect, right? There's a reason why we should be working closely together, that HRPC is not operating in a vacuum. It's also connected to like the global internet access for all, global access to the internet for all, Gaia research group that's around community networks. The measurement research group, MapRG, also has quite a bit of overlap because they look at censorship and other kinds of funky network issues. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. We also, I think, are starting to trouble a little bit that the the IETF anyway, when it's just looking at network protocols between the endpoints, it can't entirely just stay in that lane. We are also like, I think, considering a lot more, not just sometimes the metadata or our network signals, but also increasingly content. These are sort of controversial areas to expand in the IETF, but it feels important and necessary because we're kind of trying to solve problems that have a slightly wider scope than that. And that's probably a good thing, but open question. I think we'll go to the next slide. I wanted to make a pause and make sure that I mention, what it means for human rights organizations to come in and give their expertise or to be able to participate, because it isn't as straightforward as it sounds. Or maybe it doesn't sound straightforward, but this is what we've learned in any case. So we think that the IETF is one of the better examples, actually, right? Maybe one of the best of standards bodies, because all of its documentation is open, and not just its documents. It's also minutes, discussions, decisions. Everything is open. It's mailing lists, that sort of thing. The feedback process, though, can sometimes be challenging. And I think that just needs to happen. There need to be more and increasing mechanisms for that kind of broader feedback, because more and more stakeholders and more viewpoints are actually what's needed for some of the discussions we care about. And then also means, like, there have been times too where the actual cultural practices, norms, and so on of not just the IETF but other standards bodies have to also kind of be looked at or troubled or challenged a little bit, because they've operated like this for so long. But we need to expand a little bit more membership. So we've got like some ideas, right? Mostly it has to do with onboarding new attendees and things like that. And so that's some of the work. I mean, in addition to kind of trying to follow the substantive conversation, we also have to do this as well, which is kind of field building, bringing people in, helping like acclimate them to the processes and things that we're actually working on. And I think I'll just transition to Sofía by saying, like, I kind of gave you an overview of how like all of this works. But she's going to actually go into depth on what are examples of some of the things we've actually managed to achieve to give you more around this. But I'll just end. That last slide was just meant to say, coming full circle, not 10 years later, 12 years. I didn't even correct the slide. Is that the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, I already mentioned, they did the UNGP's document. They put out in November last year quite an important piece, which is kind of to say they recognize the work that had been done by us and other groups like us to bring their human rights considerations into technical bodies. So they reported on it back to the Human Rights Council and have basically told the entire human rights community to sort of join in and to follow this work. And so that's kind of a big moment. And I think it's going to change the shape, certainly of the ITU. Hopefully it also continues to sort of influence the direction of travel for the more open ones like W3C, IETF, and ICANN. So yeah, it's all good. So I'll hand it over to Sofía now to give you a little bit better picture of what are we doing anyway.
Yes. Okay, I'm unmuted. So thank you very much for that, Mallory. So yes, as Mallory was saying, basically we have this group, which is HRPC, this standardization body, which is the IETF. But one of the things that we realize is that when we participate in this standardizations body is that sometimes there's a specific type of technology that is chosen to be standardized, but sometimes that technology doesn't really take into account the experiences or the threat model of different groups that are underrepresented there, either because they are systematically underrepresented or also because, as Mallory was saying, sometimes the travel expenses or the cost of going to these standardizations bodies is too big for them to actually express their voice there. So in this case, we wanted to actually show maybe one example of something that we brought to the IETF that is kind of not something that is often talked about there, but we thought it was important because now that technology is even more pervasive in our lives, we see more and more abuse of that technology. So what we did is that we actually looked into some cases of intimate partner violence and how sometimes that partner violence is enhanced via the abuse of technology. And what we studied is by actually looking at research papers of many great researchers that I hope to list them all here. And what we wanted to find out is the numerous ways in which an abuser, that sometimes the terminology that we will be using in this talk is from abuser, but also attacker, and from victim and survivor attacker. I will be interchangeably using that terminology. But basically what we wanted to see is how this abuser exploits digital technologies to intimidate, threaten, monitor, impersonate, harass, or otherwise harm their victims. Why we wanted to do this is because, as I said, many times many companies or many organizations are putting out there certain technology that is abused specifically for these purposes. So for example, we have seen that AirTags, I think they're called, from Apple. Sometimes they are used in order to enhance the abuse of victims because they can better monitor them. And that when the design process of that specific piece of technology came to be, unfortunately, they didn't realize that they could be monitored. So we decided to create a document that say like, hey, if you are going to create something that will be tracking an item, maybe think that perhaps that could also be used to monitor a person. So we decided to approach to create this document. So one of the first things is that, of course, in the IETF, if you are going to be standardizing protocols, you have to think about the threat models in which that protocol is going to be used. And because essentially you're going to be taking maybe cryptography theory, maybe some privacy theory, then creating a protocol, standardizing it, and then putting it in the real world. And all of that has threat models. And you see usually the standard computer security privacy threat models often place these attackers as physically and socially distant attacker or someone who is spoofing on a network, right? But that assumption usually doesn't apply, for example, in the case that we have been talking, which is the case of intimate partner violence. Because in this case, you have an attacker, you have an abuser that has close contact with that specific victim, and that can also control a lot of parts of the life of that specific victim. And this threat model, what we have seen is that indeed is not addressed by the majority of the protocols that get standardized. So I'll point you here for a really great work by Lana Ramjit that I really like as a researcher. Please invite her in the future. She did a whole a study with actual victims of IPV, and she has placed all of the testimonies in how the different technology gets abused in this specific IPV case. And they have been working at the Cornell Tech University to actually also raise awareness. So what we did is precisely to take that research from her and try to describe how this attacker and how this technology can be abused. And we realize again that this abuser, as I said, has intimate access to the victim, but also that there exists an unequal power relationship that enables the attacker to cause this harm to the victim. And here we realize that it's not only about physical coercive control, but now there also exists a digital coercive control. And again, in HRPC, we talk about different groups. So one of the things is, of course, that we realize is that we were not taking into account this specific threat model, but also that we are also intersecting already with situations of discriminations against these certain genders, because what we found out through experiences and also through research is that this kind of abusive technology is mostly happen to women and non-male genders. So again, here we are trying to actually take these specific experiences and create a threat model that will be enhancing the human rights of these populations that often are not taken into account when you standardize technology at the IETF. So we were invited Lana Ramjit to actually give a presentation at IETF 114 because IETF usually meets 4 times a year. So we invited her to give a presentation. And you can find actually the recording in YouTube, as Mallory was saying. And what we do is that it was maybe one of the first times that for a lot of people on the IETF, they have heard that indeed this is also a threat model that people face every day, and then hence the IRTF and the IETF so maybe start taking into account these kind of threat models. And this again started the document that I just talked about, which is kind of a systematization of knowledge of the ways that different abusers abuse the technology and how, if we designed technology, should we preventing against this abuse. And here I have placed the document in this slide, which is this draft. So if you're interested in reading, please go to the link. And it's now adopted by the HRPC. This just basically means that the working group is going to really work on this draft. I know that this is terminology from the IETF that sometimes is unclear, but this just means that the working group is going to be working in this draft. So what we have realized here is that it's really good to put this document and try to create a good systematization of knowledge in the ways that the technology is abused, and also maybe then give some recommendations on how to stop this abuse. But maybe one of the cool things that we also realized by doing this specific exercise is that it's really important to invite different voices to the table at the moment in standardization bodies. Because again, the threat model that you face as a member of a community is not going to be the same threat model that another person faces. So if you actually want to have the different voices of different communities, you have to invite them for them to give the experience, because you can be very knowledgeable and very smart, but sometimes it actually takes the person who has suffered the experience of certain kind of threat in order to be able to really convey how that threat feels and how that it can be diminished. And something that happens a lot, and Mallory has already pointed out quite a lot, is that at some point in the IETF, we had a culture of loud men talking loudly. And here I point you to the great researcher Corinne Kath, who did an anthropological research on the culture of the IETF, and that we should strive to not create these communities, not only of having white loud men talking loudly, but actually inviting people to present and give the perspective on the different technology that we're putting out there in the world. And again, if you're doing technology, take into account that what you do is not that you don't do politics, because that's a saying that sometimes you hear when you go to standardization's body, that we shouldn't take care of human rights or privacy-preserving technologies because we don't do politics. And that we often think that that is not true. We do politics, and not just in the HRPC or the IETF, but we do politics every time that we choose a specific technology that is pushed into the real world. So with that, I invite you to join the HRPC if you want to see, and I hope this highlights a little bit of the kind of work we do. So thank you.